20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. You're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0. And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward.
Pick something, aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay, but at least it'll change in an informed way. It's like discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting. And I think that's something that's open for everyone. The hero myth might not be, the best we have might not always work, but it's still the best we have. And the fact that it might not work doesn't mean we should throw it away. It's still the best we have. I mean, everyone dies, and so we fail in some sense. The fact that a symphony ends doesn't mean that it wasn't worth listening to.
The more accurate a measure you take of someone's political beliefs, the more you find that personality is what's predicting them. And I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, because, you know, you have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You can think about them as social niches. A niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you. And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time, because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity, and the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment. And I suppose also whether you're fortunate enough so that you're born in an era where there actually is a niche for your particular temperament.
If you've explicitly formulated a set of goals and you're pursuing them, then you've adopted the responsibility to act in a certain manner to make those goals realize themselves. That's responsibility that you've adopted rather than responsibility that's been imposed on you, assuming that you've thought through the goals and you find your spirit in harmony with those goals. You can consult your resentment. I think that's a very useful step. If you find yourself angry and bitter about the things that you are responsible for doing, then that's an indication that you might be operating under some unhealthy compulsion, that you're rebelling, and that's the reason for the resentment, against the insistence that you act in a certain way. Although it's also possible that you're just immature and that rebelling against the discipline that's necessary to attain the goals that you genuinely do want to attain and that are valid and that you are actively engaged in constructing. So you have to get that straight, and some of that's a consequence of thought, and again, some of that's a consequence of discussion with other people with whom you're intimate enough to have a conversation like that, and perhaps they have conversations about similar things with you if you're fortunate.
Well, let's say you want to fix up your house, which is actually quite a lot like fixing yourself up, which is a very common dream metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing you want to do is go look around and see what needs to be fixed. The interesting thing about that, and this is akin to what comedians do, is that as soon as you're willing to admit that you have a problem, then you've immediately contacted the part of yourself that's at least strong enough to admit that you have a problem. The act of admitting the problem is actually the first step to solving it. And it's an optimistic step, because you might say, oh my God, I can't admit to it that I have a problem, because what if I can't solve it? If you do admit to it, you're simultaneously admitting to the possibility that you could solve it. And then it can actually become something that's optimistic. You can say, well, my life is horrible. It's like, okay, but I'm doing 50 things wrong. Well, great, I could fix those things, and then maybe it wouldn't be so horrible.
we should make much more of an effort to ensure that kids are unbelievably proficient readers. And a lot of that is going to involve early automatization of letter and phoneme and syllable and word recognition. So, because what happens is when you teach a child to read, first of all, you teach them the alphabet and the sounds. And we have an alphabetic language, thank God, because it makes things much simpler. And so you teach them the letters and then the 2-letter combinations and then the 3-letter combinations. And then they can sound out syllables and then they get words. But it isn't until you can read phrases automatically at a glance that you can read for content and pleasure. And so a lot of kids get stuck, especially if they don't come from particularly literate homes where all of this is sort of taught, maybe starting at 12 months when they're first dragging a book around and becoming familiar with the book as an object, right, before they even learn to read. You got to get kids through that automatization phase, and that requires intense mass practice. And that's not that intrinsically interesting, right? But if you can get them to the point where they can read for content, well then, it starts to become interesting, just as interesting, let's say, as going to a movie or perhaps playing a video game. And so that has to be made an absolute priority. And if the faculties of education were doing their job, they would have produced technology to solve that problem for virtually every child, because it is only a matter of practice. Smarter kids will learn faster, but with enough practice, pretty much everybody is going to get there. So, and then there's the marketing issue. It's like, well, why should you read? Well, do you want to be stupid? You want to be stupid? What happens when you're stupid? You walk into walls because you don't see them. And if someone comes along who's more educated than you, more literate and cannier, you'll lose, man. You'll lose. And you'll lose too because you can't think properly. So you won't aim at the right things and you won't be informed by the great individuals of the past. And you need that. We're historical creatures. This isn't optional. Part of it has to be marketing, for lack of a better word. It's not really that, it's an explanation. Why be literate? It helps you become who you could be. It helps you move out into the world and have your great adventure and to bring people along. God only knows what you can do if you've got your words lined up properly. And young men would listen to that if someone who knew what they were talking about was telling them that. If you're having a discussion with someone and they're talking about things that don't have those characteristics, right, that they haven't made personal, then the conversation is almost never interesting. It's because the person they really are an empty shell through which ideology, cliches, and slogans are pouring. There's nothing about that that's compelling because you don't see the grappling. You don't see that the other person has grappled with the ideas and come to their own unique conclusions. And it really is in that mingling of the abstract and the particular, compelling wisdom is to be found. Concretely speaking, well, there's ways of earning your knowledge, and part of that is reformulating it in your own words. That's thinking it through, right? And discussing it until you have it at hand. You can talk about it and you can generalize from it because you truly understand it. But a huge part of that is also putting it into practice and deriving your own conclusions as a consequence. And some of that can be done with debate. It's like, here's an idea I came across, and here's the idea, and here's what I think it means. And this is how I think it would change things if I put it into practice. This is how I understand this idea. And what do you think of that? Like, that's a good debate or discussion.